Okay, dear viewers, thank you for joining us. You are watching our weekly program, Talk to OBN, on your favorite media channel, OBN Horn of Africa. In this edition, we'll be discussing about the U.S. Foreign diplomacy and foreign relation after Trump's election. To discuss this matter, I am joining by Professor Lawrence Freeman. Professor, thank you for your time.
Okay, good to be here.
Well done. How do you view U.S. foreign policy against Africa?
Well, we have to realize that President Trump will make some changes in the policy of the United States towards the nations of Africa. Some of them will be reasonable, but overall, it will not be a substantive change in policy. I believe that President Trump will cut back on the blanket amount of aid that is sent to Africa. I think that there will be less of an emphasis on forcing African nations to adopt U.S. democracy proposals. There'll be a reduction in emphasis on human rights, on good governance. And the focus that Trump will have, which he's shown already, is that he's looking to make money for the private sector companies in the United States. So his relationship to the African nations will be transactional. There will be people in his administration, some have already been accepted for the cabinet positions, and he himself have this view of using Africa to counter China in their geopolitical rules-based order mentality. I don't know if he'll follow through on that, but that's certainly something that has been discussed, and I would consider a failed policy. The United States should have a positive policy and understand the benefits of developing Africa from the standpoint of the U.S. economy and the global economy, and should not see African nations as pawns in their chessboard diplomacy against China, which won't work anyway, because China has a very strong multilateral relationship to Africa.
Donald Trump issued several executive orders and directives on his first day back to office. How do you see these executive orders?
But some of the executive orders are going to affect Africa. For example, I believe that Secretary of State Rubio has already announced a freeze on aid. That will certainly affect African nations. Obviously, that the president has an obsession with keeping immigrants from illegally entering the United States. I'm not sure how much that's going to affect the Africans at this point. And then, of course, there are a number of people he's bringing into the head of the CIA, national security advisors, others who have a attitude towards Africa that is not productive. There's been a lot of pressure being put on the Republic of South Africa because they're a member of the BRICS. And of course, President Trump has twice said he will tax the BRICS 100% if they do not follow his policies on the so-called investment using the dollar currency. So it doesn't look very positive at this point. But again, we don't know it's only been a week since he's been in office. So we have to still give some time to see how these policies develop.
What should Africa do to cope up with very harmful executive orders already signed by the president?
Well, there's nothing African nations can do to change executive orders by the president. What the African nations should be thinking about, and this is very relevant because you have several African nations that are members of the BRICS and partners of the BRICS. And the BRICS is a very powerful institution. So if you take members and partners, it's about 22 countries. It represents the majority of the world's population, reserves, other critical minerals. And then the BRICS is actually a leading institution of the global South. which is 85 to 90% of the world population. So therefore, we should be thinking about how do we move forward to entice the United States, so to speak, with the own independent policies of the nations of Africa, the BRICS, and the global South. We need to have a development bank, and we need to have a significant amount of credit that has to be issued for massive vital infrastructure projects in Africa. And this is something that the African nations, the BRICS, and the global South can proceed on, and then hopefully bring the United States along. But there's nothing any African nation can do in regard to the various initiative and executive orders from President Trump.
Ethiopia has been banned by U.S. government to participate or to get a benefit out of the AGOA privilege. What will happen on this case again?
Well, this is an interesting question because AGOA has to come up for renewal by the United States Congress this year, 2025. AGOA has in the past has received bipartisan support from both the Democrat and Republican parties. However, under President Biden, during the war of Tigray to overthrow the government of Ethiopia, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, the United States stupidly took AGOA out, removed Ethiopia from AGOA, and therefore removed the benefits that Ethiopia would achieve from having tariff-free products into the United States. In the last Congress, there were a number of Republican congressmen who were threatening the removal of the Republic of South Africa from AGOA because they claim that South Africa is too close to China and Russia, which of course are both members of the BRICS, which South Africa is. So my concern is that AGOA, which is a trade and commerce policy, is now has been used as a political weapon against Ethiopia and other countries, and may be used as a political weapon against South Africa if some of these Republicans are able to convince the president. So this should not be an issue for the president and this Congress, but it will be. I would hope, even though AGOA, from my standpoint, is limited in its benefit, it hasn't been given support for the last 2 decades by both Republicans and Democrats, and that probably should go forward, but we're not really sure because many of the picks that Donald Trump has requested for cabinet positions and sub-cabinet positions don't understand the importance of AGOA and want to use it against the African nations that don't behave according to their, quote, rules-based order ideology.
The U.S. usually keeps its eyes, against the Horn of Africa. Will you just tell us if a possible paradigm shift is happening after the coming of Donald Trump? Will we see changes from Biden administration in this part of the world?
Well, I think there may be. Don't forget, during the previous administration of President Trump, he tried to force through a deal to favor Egypt against the interest of Ethiopia developing the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And of course, this effort failed. The Ethiopian government in Washington did not submit. And then, of course, there was a threat that President Trump made, rather foolish, about, quote, potential bombing of the GERD Dam. Now the situation has changed. One is that it's been discussed in Washington that Peter Pham, a Republican, previous envoy in the Biden administration, that he may become the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. He has already gone on record that he approves of the United States recognition of Somaliland. Now, this, of course, is an issue because a year ago, January, There was an MOU, which I've never seen, talking about recognizing Somaliland by the Ethiopian government in return for a port and a certain amount of area for a naval base. Subsequently, the issue is quieted down in meetings between Prime Minister Abiy and the president of Somalia in Turkey. But if the United States were to go ahead and recognize Somaliland, this could ruffle some feathers, especially if it's done outside of the African Union. I think the African Union, even though it's not the strongest institution, should be involved in this process. However, the United States may go ahead and do it on their own because they think there's great economic value to be made out of Ethiopia having its own control over its own commercial port. And they're correct in that position. I've supported now for the last year that Ethiopia needs a new port to manage on its own to expand its commercial activities from its growing economy. However, we have to be very careful on how this takes place because we don't want to do it outside of collaboration with African nations. But this would be a very significant change in the Horn of Africa and a very significant change from President Trump's past support for Egypt. Now, he still has very close relations, and his family does, to Egypt. So I don't know if that's going to enter into the new policy for the Horn of Africa or not. But the other thing is the President Trump does not want military interventions. I don't believe he would do the same things that Biden did and the Biden government did in giving de facto support to the Tigray Liberation Front against the government of Ethiopia. He wants to make money. He wants to make money for investors in the United States. He does not want confrontations, and he doesn't want regime change, which is another thing that's come up about people advocating, conservative Republicans advocating the overthrow of the government of the president of Eritrea. This would be dangerous and stupid and destabilize the Horn of Africa. Potentially tens of thousands of people, if not more, would suffer from such an irresponsible regime change. But it has been discussed by Republicans who are supporters of President Trump. I hope he's smarter than that to get involved in a dangerous move such as regime change.
To be very specific, what will be the possible diplomatic engagement that U.S. will have with that of Ethiopia?
Well, I think, again, if we go by the profile of what President Trump believes and what he has said, I think that he would like to see increased economic activity with Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. Because as I said earlier, he thinks like a businessman. He thinks only in transactional terms of making money. The problem, even though that would could be positive, and I think he will place less of an emphasis in Ethiopia on, quote, the Western version of democracy, human rights, and good governance, which I think is also helpful because though the obsession of the liberal Democrats on those issues has been detrimental. However, what President Trump has not shown to me yet is an understanding of economics, or what I call physical economy. Africa needs billions, if not trillions of dollars in vital infrastructure, water, energy, roads, schools, hospitals. And this would develop the continent, which is going to have 2.5 billion people in 25 years, which could become great consumers, and industries could become great consumers of U.S. capital goods and other advanced technologies that would advance the economies of Africa. So if we help an African continent of 2.5 billion people in the future develop, this increases the demand for economic exports from the United States. This question of development is not properly understood I don't believe, by Trump and his supporters. They focus on financial money making, and I focus on profitability from industrial development that raises the standard of living of people. But if you raise the standard of living of 2.5 billion people, which the African continent will have, and a workforce of 1 billion people, then you actually elevate and advance the entire world economy and the United States. I don't think that President Trump has fully thought this thing through. I'm hoping he will, and that's what I've been trying to get him to do.
Let's talk about withdrawal of the US from the WHO. How impactful will this be to the global health industry that heavily relies on American support for years?
Yeah, this will have an effect. Now we don't know all these executive directive actions by President Trump, of course, can be reversed, mitigated, and changed over time. I believe that in the first administration of President Trump, he also withdrew from the WHO. I think this is a mistake. I think it's important, even if the United States has disagreements with the WHO, that we be part of these important international institutions, especially one dealing with health. And I think we should remain in the WHO. I don't know all his reasons for leaving. I think last time in his first administration, he claimed that the WHO was controlled by China. But I think that would hurt the funding for many of the countries in the developing sector, including in Africa, that do depend on the World Health Organization for support and scientific discoveries and vaccines and all the things that affect the health of people and the longevity of their lives.
Let's talk about non-citizens who live in the US, especially African Americans who traveled illegally or in other means to the US. What will be the action taken by Biden? We've been hearing similar propaganda nowadays about Trump's plan to ban them from the US.
Well, the main area that Trump is obsessed with on this, of course, is illegal immigrants. And according to what I've read, if people enter the country legally, they're not going to have a problem. I think that the way that President Trump is going to go about, or appears to be going about, the removal of immigrants in the United States is not productive. It's going to be divisive, and hopefully it won't reach the level of internal unrest in the United States if we have parts of the military being used against the American people, which is against the law. But I think it's clear that he's going to prevent immigrants from all over the world from entering the United States illegally. And I think that right now is going to be a fact of life during the Trump administration. And there's nothing that anybody's going to do to change that. That's one of his campaign promises, one of his obsessions, and he's not going to be dissuaded from carrying it out. So people coming to the United States will have to come legally and work through the system that we have in the United States for the time being.
Let me talk about U.S.-China relation, China, U.S. with Russia, with these big giants. What will be the possible diplomatic engagement within this nation, these big giants?
I think that President Trump is clearly going to have a different approach to Russia and President Putin and China and President Xi Jinping. Look, the Biden administration on these areas was a complete disaster. I mean, the fact that the United States gave full support, hundreds of billions of dollars of military and other support to Ukraine, and never once did Biden try to seek a discussion with President Putin to discuss a peace to the war. This shows you clearly that Biden was not interested in achieving peace. And this, unfortunately, we see from the Democrats. He also made China the #1 enemy. Now, this is the obsession of the rules-based order that the West must put down, must suppress, must weaken China. So its influence in the world doesn't grow. Whether Trump has endorsed that completely or not, I don't know. Many of the people coming into his administration on cabinet and sub-cabinet positions are what we call China hawks. They have a very negative view and they want to hurt China economically, politically, and some militarily. So he has that people coming in. Whether he rises above that and establishes a better relationship with these two other superpowers, I think it's quite possible. I think that everything is going to be decided in large part by Trump's personal discussions and meetings, hopefully, with President Putin and his personal discussions and meetings with President Xi Jinping. And I think that he will override potentially many of the impulses that some of the China hawks have against those countries. That's what I think is going to happen. He's already had one phone call with China's leadership, with the president, and the vice president, who was in the United States, also had meetings with with his counterparts informally. So I am hopeful that President Trump will have a completely different approach and a more positive approach to working out positive relations. Don't forget, if the United States, a superpower in economics, and China, another economic superpower, if these two countries were to unite, there's nothing we can't accomplish in the world. And if we have Russia, China, the United States working together, which is something that Franklin Roosevelt was able to do during the war, if we have these superpowers working together, we can end the threat of nuclear war, and we could change the world into an area where development of all nations and all people is the primary strategic focus instead of the zero-sum game mentality that we see from the West.
Hopefully, the US is not comfortable with the formation of BRICS. If that is the case, what is the possible counter development popping out from the US side?
Well, that is true that there is a danger. I mean, President Trump has twice talked about 100% tariff on the BRICS nations if they undermine the US dollar and move to a different currency. Now, the BRICS themselves have expressed no intention of establishing a currency outside the US dollar. They have involved themselves in local regional currency transactions, but I don't think that's going to weaken the dollar. So I'm not sure what has motivated Trump to make such threatening tones against the BRIC nations, but it's a mistake. I mean, the BRICS represent a positive dynamic in the world, as does the global South. And there's no reason that these nations can't work in a cooperative economic relationship with the United States. But the United States has to give up this insistence that it is the hegemon in the world, that the zero-sum mentality of the rule-based order says we must be on top, the US must be on top. And frankly, the financial institutions of the Bretton Woods have failed to perform well in developing the nations of the world. They did not carry out the mandate that was given to them by Franklin Roosevelt, who created them. So therefore, we should have a reform of the Bretton Woods institutions, and we should give up the zero-sum game mentality and establish a relationship of cooperation and development.
Comments are coming out that Trump's executive orders signal America first goal. Do you see that America is growing into taking a more conservative stance on global matters now?
I think that's a fair assessment, that the United States is going to pull back from some of its interventions. I mean, this freeze or pause that Senator Rubio has issued on USAID, I think is part of that. I think they're going to review the relationship to various institutions like the WHO. I don't think the United States is going to withdraw from the United Nations, but they might make some changes in the way they operate. So I think, yes, the Trump administration is going to have less of an orientation towards global intervention, which is good because the Democrats, if we look at the recent Obama and then Biden administrations, have gotten us into wars, and also George W. Bush in the war in Iraq. But these wars are destroying countries, U.S. money, and in some cases, U.S. lives. So I think the orientation away from military intervention in the world is good. Unfortunately, I don't know if the Trump administration and his leadership and his group of supporters in cabinet positions understand what a positive relationship could be. And that's what I'm trying to educate them on.
U.S. Deliberately piece of giant computing nations. Uh, who are the most trustworthy ally of the U.S. this time around?
Well, again, there's the United States wrongly considers these countries you mentioned, which go under the name of the axis of evil, as our enemies. I don't see them as our enemies. I think there are countries that have a different orientation and at times take policies that are not in the interest of the United States. But that's the point of diplomacy and leadership and statesmen. And Franklin Roosevelt was a great statesman. So a statesman finds a way to find policies and initiatives that are in the interest of all those countries. Unfortunately, the United States stopped doing that decades ago. And Trump, unfortunately, doesn't appear to be any different. From his standpoint, whatever the America First is, he would see any nation that does not help the United States make money would not be seen as an ally. Again, he is a businessman. He's not a statesman. I don't know if he understands the history of how the United States economy and country, our nation was built, but he wants to make money, and that becomes an overriding factor. So those nations that he can work out, quote, a deal with, a financial deal with, will be collaborators of his. And otherwise, the question remained whether Trump has the vision and intellectual moral qualities to break from the rules-based order, which divides the world up into winners and losers, victims and victors. Does he have that quality in him to break from that mentality that has ruled the United States for the last 6 decades? I would like to believe he does, and would help him if he does. If he sticks to the same rules-based order mentality of zero-sum game, then unfortunately, the world will not be moving forward in the best direction.
Professor Lawrence Freeman, we really appreciate your insights. Thank you very much on behalf of OBN Horn. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. This brings you to the end of our edition. Bye-bye. Take care. Have a good one.